Exactly.
You know.
This is.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So HBO, why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are and where you came from, how you got to where you are now?
Sure. So before I took on my present role as the head of HBO Sports, I was strictly working doing the matchmaking and negotiations of the fights that HBO does on live boxing. Prior to that, I was a freelance journalist for about 3 years, and prior to that, I worked in the art world at an art advisory firm.
So we were talking a little bit about this before, and you said you recognized a lot about the art world in the boxing world, and that there were some strong crossovers. So
same thing.
Thing. Why that does not sound.
I mean, they're both
intuitive.
Completely unregulated industry. No,
yeah.
They are very akin in that a dynamic between a boxing promoter and a stable of fighters is almost tantamount between the relationship between an art gallerist and a stable of artists.
Right.
You know, these people are people of business savvy. These people generally are not. These people all think that they're the best in the world at what they do, if not the greatest of all time, and that they're not being paid enough attention to or being paid enough money. And these people have the experience previously of these people eventually having someone come along and say, well, how much are you getting paid? Well, you're worth $5 more than that.
Yeah.
And I've yet to meet the person who thinks they're overpaid. I've yet to meet that person. So eventually they leave.
Yeah. So, I mean, crossing over from a degree, a background in ancient Greek and working in the arts, and suddenly landing at a television network or cable network and working on sports. How did you manage that crossover? I mean, it may be the same in a metaphorical way, but you show up at HBO.
I was very lucky in that I was doing some work as a journalist, and my work was read by an executive at HBO, who's now our CEO, and he really embraces a company culture of seeing in people what he thinks their potential is, and the transference of skills. So even though I really didn't know what I was doing when I first started matchmaking and negotiating fights, the company culture there is one of see the talent in people, both internally, and really what that translates to is the external culture of the brand that is all about empowering artists and storytellers. So even though I had an arts background rather than a sports background, we're not a sports network, we're a storytelling franchise. And so in that respect, the skills were highly transferable.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so the title of the talk is Teammates and Opponents, but I think the focus is really customers. So cord cutters is a conversation people in the media have been having for a long, long time. Where are you on that at HBO? What do you think is going on there, and how have you kind of positioned yourself to?
Sure. I mean, long preceding my time at the network, it's always been a company of innovation, and that's embraced innovation, and that goes back to being the first service ever to have movies uninterrupted without commercials, the first 24-hour network service, the first service to have digital instead of analog, and HBO Go has a kind of similar moment in terms of the medium serving as the message. But in addition, the type of storytelling that is done on the network embraces that as well. And it was really the first network that had cinematic film style narratives that were being told on TV. And I think what you also see is the nature of the type of storytelling serves two interesting purposes. One is about a journey and taking someone on that journey, and then the other is about giving someone something that's fun to watch at the same time. And there's very little programming, I think, that treats that holistically rather than as a dichotomy. And so what we're always hunting down is the types of programming that's going to do that. From a sports standpoint, we're always looking to use sports as a lens, a prism through which you're going to tell stories about socioeconomic, political, ideas about success and failure through competition.
Yeah.
And that's what dovetails with the other programming that the company does, whether that's Game of Thrones or Ballers or the other types of programming we do.
Do you think generally in the marketplace, sports programming is more immune to cord cutting and people who don't want to subscribe, or
live sports? Yes. Certainly, a lot of people feel that way, and the numbers seem to reveal that story as well, because live sports is without a needed marketing campaign, because it doesn't appeal to your self-esteem or how sexy you are or how much money you have or any of that. All it does is appeal to someone on the level of, is this authentic, is it good, or is it bad? Yeah. And if it's good, they're going to watch, and if it's not, they're not. Right. And sports really is reliant on that as its driver, and it's not that difficult when you're dealing with athletes of an elite level to be able to create that authenticity.
Interesting. And you notice a lot of, there's a trend certainly with a lot of non-sports television programming where there are cliffhangers, there are these kind of worlds to get into. The amount of discussion about Westworld or Big Little Lies is so much larger than the actual amount of time that people are watching. Is that a trend that you think applies to sports? Is it something that you think about capitalizing on?
It does in boxing for us. It applies in that you're constantly asking, where is this fight coming from and to where is it going? Yeah. So you're constantly trying to thread that narrative. On the other programming that we do, say Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, which is an investigative news program, or Hard Knocks, which is with the NFL, done with NFL Films, programs like that are really more, they try to build communities around the stories that they're telling. And I think the nature of the way in which the program is done at HBO, where you're not releasing in bulk, but you're releasing week by week, it gives people time to all be on the same page and have some common ground for discussion and be able to really mine what the stories are talking about. In addition to the fact that there are all these subtle plays on genre that I think a lot of our best programming does. Sopranos was a mafia show, but it was really a family drama. Sex and the City was a comedy, but it was really a soap opera. Game of Thrones is a fantasy show, but it's really about corporate America or something, I don't know.
And how does that play into politics? Into sports in the programming?
I was like, getting heavy. Okay.
How does it play into something you have nothing to do with? No. But how do you genre blend in sports? Is it?
Again, I think we're not looking strictly for documentaries, for example, that look at this team won that game on that date and wasn't that a beautiful thing. Yeah. Sometimes we are, and sometimes there are love letters to write to history. Yeah. But by and large, there was a literary critic named Helen Gardner who was writing about T.S. Eliot, and she said that he created the taste by which he was enjoyed. It's like, and that's really what you're trying to get into from a artist standpoint. What you're trying to do is tell stories that get to a place that looks at things in a way other people haven't looked at it before. And right now we're working on a documentary about Andre the Giant with Bill Simmons. And that's in theory a sports story, but wrestling in the 80s was really sports entertainment. It really wasn't sport, and it's about really that man's struggle with, at the age of 14 years old, he was basically told, you're going to grow so fast, you're going to die by the time you're 40. And how does someone choose to live his life once they're given that kind of death sentence?
Interesting. What do you make of, there's also so much appetite for nostalgia out there now. You look at, the fact that there were 2 programs based on O.J. Simpson last year that were radically different. You had a really imaginative kind of retelling of the history, and then you had a straightforward ESPN documentary. Is there territory there? You mentioned love letters to a game or a particular championship, but is there space to kind of look back?
I think there is, but what you really need is a filmmaker who truly has something to say. You should never put a piece of art out there unless you really have something to say. Ezra Edelman, the director of the OJ documentary,
Yes.
really had something to
Yeah.
say, had something profound to say about
America.
race relations over a sweep of 40 years, using Los Angeles as a microcosm for a macro issue. And when there are filmmakers like that, we are always looking to ferret them out and try to engage them and find stories that they're passionate about, because that's what's going to produce the great art. And to a certain degree, you want to try to stay a step ahead of where the zeitgeist is. People don't know the stories that they want to have told to them. As much as we would like to be purely algorithmic in the firmware inside our heads, really people don't know. And for an example of that, see anyone, anywhere, of who they thought they would end up with when they were a teenager, and look at who you're with today. It's like you just don't know.
Yes.
And that spontaneity is what people look for out of certain types of programming that's going to deregulate their rhythms. And that's what great art is really designed to do.
Yeah. When you are thinking about pay-per-view or a live event, so much of the business used to just be getting the viewers to the theater, getting their money for the ticket, and giving them the show without interruption. And now, obviously, that hasn't changed, but you have so much more data available, and so much more is happening around Twitter and social media as something is happening. So how does HBO look at that information? Is it metrics of success, whether we should do this kind of program again, or is it a way of making programming decisions in the future? What do you make of this sort of activity available to you as things are happening?
You want to create a broad programming mosaic, really, and try to see where different tiles can fit in. A TV show like The Wire, for example, struggled in its initial years, and now people look at it in retrospect and say that was one of the greatest TV shows of all time. So sometimes it takes us time to catch up to the art that was made previously. From a fight standpoint, there's a lot more data available. There's a technological side of it in terms of integrating VR, AR, what that looks like in terms of the fan engagement, how immersed do people want to be in the experience of looking at the screen versus looking at a second screen, when is that experience passive, when is it active, and how to best mobilize their passion for the sport that they're in, as well as bring in people who aren't necessarily boxing fans and say to them, well, here's a reason to get engaged. And so when we do programs like 24/7, we do a program like My Fight, which was just nominated for an Emmy, those programs are designed to tell the stories behind the fight itself, so that if your thing isn't watching two men wearing 8-ounce gloves hit each other, and you don't really understand the kind of Zen art that goes on behind that, and you just see the brutality of that, what is it about their stories that led them there? Because no one chooses to do that for a living because they grew up like me, the son of an orthodontist. That's not generally where these people are coming from. They're coming from places where, for example, one fighter, his trainer was a founding member of one of the main gangs from Chicago, and he came down to the city where he grew up and made sure that this kid, who's now a multiple-time world champion, never had to join a gang. That kid ended up being shot in the back of the head growing up. He ended up overcoming those kinds of adversity. A fighter like Manny Pacquiao, he grew up, his dad ate his dog one time because that's how bad the poverty was that he was facing in General Santos, where he grew up. And you see these incredible arcs, rises to a place where they're fighting for millions of dollars, and it's one of the only sports in the world where you can grow up and be 5'4" and 126 pounds and go on to be a global icon. And so to be able to provide that type of opportunity is an incredible responsibility that we take very seriously, because and you're pairing the talent with the stories and mining those stories out of people. And often people who come from those backgrounds, it takes them a while to want to warm up and really tell you. Sometimes it takes us a year or two even to really mine that emotional piece of their story from where they came from and how best to tell them, like, we're not exploiting your past, but we're helping open this idea up for other people like you that there's a path there.
Yeah. So as a storytelling shop, enterprise, how do you think about the sort of deluge of new technology that you mentioned AR just a minute ago? There's a lot of interest and hype around some of these new ways of presenting programming. How do you kind of decide what is worth investing in and investigating?
We're constantly meeting with outside companies. We're developing technology in-house. We're obviously part of the Time Warner umbrella, so other technology that's coming from other parts of the company filter in our way. So we take meetings constantly and do tests constantly and do R&D and take a look at what we can do to better integrate, whether it's our live telecast or use of drones on a show like Real Sports, where we're really trying to capture, in the special that we did about the corruption related to the IOC down in Brazil, and really trying to capture what was going on in terms of the pollution of the waters through the favelas and all of that. That was best visually captured in some cases using cameras that we hadn't used previously and really experimenting with the tech. So it's not just the experience of the viewer in terms of how they're engaging their own technology, but it's also the tech that we're investing in terms of the production of the show itself.
Okay, great. Well, good. I think that's our time.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.